Bryce McAllister never imagined he would become the subject of such intense scrutiny. A quiet, unassuming man of 38, he had always kept to himself, enjoying a simple life in a small town on the outskirts of St. Louis. His job as a night shift IT technician for a large firm was the perfect fit. It required little social interaction, and that was exactly how he liked it. He preferred solitude, finding peace in the quiet hours when most of the world was asleep. But beneath the surface of his calm exterior, Bryce harbored a dark secret. In the summer of 2021, that secret nearly came crashing down around him. It started with a series of murders that gripped the city in fear. 4 women were found dead in less than 2 months, each brutally strangled, their bodies left in isolated areas just outside town. The media dubbed the killer the Night Ripper due to his nocturnal habits, and as the police scrambled for leads, the town's anxiety grew. Rumors spread like wildfire, and with each passing day, people became more suspicious of their neighbors, wondering who among them might be hiding something sinister. Bryce wasn't particularly worried at first. He had always been careful, meticulous, even. His kills were planned down to the smallest detail. The women he chose were loners, drifters, people who would take months to be missed, if they ever were. He wore gloves, left no traceable DNA, and buried their personal belongings in places no one would think to search. His method was precise, efficient, and, above all, invisible. But then the police showed up at his door. It was a Tuesday evening when they arrived, knocking firmly but not aggressively. Bryce had been expecting it. Well, maybe not this, but something like it. The media had painted the profile of the Night Ripper as a loner, someone who kept to the shadows, who worked odd hours, and who had a methodical nature. Bryce fit that profile almost too perfectly. As a man who lived alone and worked nights, it wasn't long before someone in his neighborhood reported his suspicious behavior to the authorities. He answered the door with his usual calm demeanor, greeting the 2 officers with a polite but distant smile. "Bryce McAllister?" the lead officer asked. "Yes, that's me," Bryce replied. "We'd like to ask you a few questions about the recent murders," the officer said, his tone neutral but probing. Bryce nodded, gesturing for them to come inside. His house was immaculate, sparsely furnished, and devoid of anything personal. It was exactly what he wanted, a place that revealed nothing about him. As the officers sat down on his couch, Bryce kept his breathing steady, his mind racing through potential scenarios. He had prepared for this, rehearsed every possible answer in his head, and now it was time to execute. They asked the usual questions: where he had been on the nights of the murders, if he knew any of the victims, if anyone could corroborate his whereabouts. Bryce answered each question calmly, his alibi airtight. He was always either at work or at home during the hours in question, and no, he didn't know any of the women. His job, he explained, kept him isolated, and he didn't socialize much outside of work. After an hour of questioning, the officers seemed satisfied. They didn't have anything solid to hold him on, just vague suspicions from his neighbors, who thought it was strange that a man his age lived alone and worked nights. Bryce had heard the whispers before, but they had never bothered him. Now, however, those whispers had put him on the radar of the police. As they left, one of the officers turned to him. "Thanks for your time, Mr. McAllister. If we need anything else, we'll be in touch." Bryce watched them leave, closing the door quietly behind them. His heart raced for a moment, but then he exhaled slowly, letting the tension drain from his body. They had nothing, just as he had anticipated. He had been careful, after all. But this was only the beginning. Within days of the police visit, Bryce noticed a shift in the way people treated him. His neighbors, who had always been cordial but distant, now actively avoided him. When he went for his nightly walks, he could feel their eyes on him, watching from behind curtains and half-closed blinds. At the grocery store, the cashier who used to make small talk now barely looked at him, scanning his items in silence before offering a terse "have a good night." But it wasn't just strangers who began to pull away. His sister, Julie, with whom he had never been particularly close but still maintained a relationship, stopped returning his calls. She had always been a bit judgmental, critical of his solitary lifestyle, but now it was as though she had made up her mind about him without even asking. The last time they had spoken, he could hear the hesitance in her voice, the unspoken accusation lingering between the lines. "Bryce, is there anything you want to tell me?" she had asked, her tone almost pleading. "No, Julie," he had replied firmly. "There's nothing to tell." That was the last time they spoke. As the days turned into weeks, his isolation grew. Friends from his past, those few who had stayed in contact over the years, stopped reaching out. His social media accounts went silent, notifications dwindling to nothing. Even at work, his co-workers, already few in number due to his night shift schedule, began to treat him differently. There were no direct accusations, but the distance was palpable. No one wanted to be associated with a potential serial killer, even if it was just a suspicion. Then the media got wind of it. A local news station ran a segment about the Night Ripper investigation, and although Bryce's name wasn't mentioned, it was clear who they were talking about. A person of interest had been questioned but not charged, and the community was urged to remain vigilant. The segment was vague, but it was enough to fan the flames of suspicion. His photo began circulating on social media, accompanied by baseless accusations and wild speculation. Bryce stopped leaving his house during the day, opting to run his errands late at night, when the streets were empty. He had always valued his solitude, but now it felt like the world had exiled him. And in a strange way, it was liberating. 2 months passed, and the investigation stalled. The police never returned to his door. There were no new leads, no fresh evidence, and eventually, the murders stopped altogether. Bryce had planned for that too. He knew the importance of patience, the value of letting the storm pass. And now, it seemed, the storm was over. The police held a press conference in late August, announcing that while Bryce had been a person of interest, they had no substantial evidence linking him to the crimes. He was cleared, officially, but the damage had already been done. His reputation was in tatters, his relationships shattered beyond repair. But Bryce didn't care. In fact, he found that he preferred it this way. The world had given him what he had always wanted: isolation. With no friends left and his family out of his life, Bryce was free to move through the shadows without the burden of pretense. His nocturnal routines no longer raised eyebrows. After all, he was just a strange IT guy, someone the town had briefly feared but ultimately forgotten. His job kept him away from people, his colleagues barely interacting with him beyond the occasional email. He was invisible, exactly as he had always wanted to be. And that meant he could continue his work. The first kill after the investigation was a test, an experiment to see if the world was still watching him. He had chosen the woman carefully, just as he always did. She was a drifter, passing through town, with no family ties and no one who would miss her. Bryce followed her for 2 nights, watching as she moved between bars, sleeping in her car on the outskirts of town. On the 3rd night, he struck. It was simple, efficient, and quiet. He had perfected the art of killing without fanfare, without the messy theatrics that often got others caught. There was no need for drawn-out torture or unnecessary violence. He preferred strangulation. It was intimate, personal, and left no blood. She had barely made a sound as he tightened the garrote around her neck, her eyes wide with shock, her hands grasping at nothing. When it was done, Bryce carefully disposed of her body in the woods outside of town. He had scouted the area weeks in advance, ensuring it was remote and rarely visited. The body would decay before anyone found it, if they ever did. He was meticulous in his cleanup, leaving no trace of her existence in his home or on his clothes. The police never connected her disappearance to him. In fact, it wasn't even linked to the Night Ripper at all. By that point, the town had already moved on from the fears that had gripped them months earlier. The media, hungry for new headlines, had shifted its focus to other tragedies, other mysteries. Bryce was no longer on anyone's radar. With each subsequent kill, Bryce grew more confident. He became bolder, but never reckless. His nocturnal hobby, once a source of tension and stress, had now become something he could fully embrace. The isolation, the loss of his friends and family, had been a blessing in disguise. There was no one to question his late-night excursions, no one to ask why he spent so much time alone. The world had given up on him, and in doing so, it had freed him. His kills became more frequent, but he maintained his careful methods. He targeted those who wouldn't be missed: runaways, drifters, sex workers. People who lived on the margins of society, just as he did. He didn't need the media attention, the notoriety. He wasn't like the other killers who craved recognition. Bryce was content to remain in the shadows, his actions known only to him. There were moments, in the quiet hours before dawn, when he would reflect on how close he had come to losing everything. The investigation, the media frenzy, it had all been a distraction, a temporary disruption to his carefully controlled world. But now, as he stood over his latest victim, her lifeless body sprawled in the dirt, he felt a sense of peace. He had been cleared, absolved in the eyes of the law, and now he was free to continue his work without fear of interruption. The world had moved on, leaving Bryce exactly where he had always wanted to be, invisible, unnoticed, and utterly alone. And in that solitude, he thrived.